Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and those are the first 8 bars of a real jazz standard, Lullaby of Birdland. So it's a George Shearing number. And we're just going to have a little look at what's going on that might just reveal something of the compositional process, if you like, that might be helpful to songwriters, composers out there, and just to see, well, how does this all kind of add up to something that makes for a good song? Well, we could take the whole song, but I'm just wanting to focus on these first 8 bars so we can kind of go to town on it a little bit. So first of all, let's take a look at what's going on in the melody. It's quite interesting that the verse here starts on a chord of F minor, and then we finish in bar 8 in A flat major. So we're starting in a minor key, we're finishing off in its relative major key. That's quite an interesting transition. It's closely related keys, but the sense of ending up with a slightly more optimistic finish that is then going to launch us into the next part of the song, you know. That's what flows on from it. So we kind of go to the major, and then the next section feels just a bit more optimistic, if you like. So interesting how that tonality thing, major minor, can just kind of change the musical character a little bit. Okay, well, let's have a look at this melodic line and see what's going on, because there's also movement within these 8 bars, isn't there? So we've got a melodic idea that starts like this. Here's the first phrase. And I'm going to suggest that that itself breaks into 2 halves. So we've got the first half coming down the scale. So we're in F minor. We're coming down from the 5th note of the scale to the 1st note of the scale. So that's a very simple melodic idea, isn't it? Just coming down 5 notes of a scale. And I'm going to suggest that the next half of that first phrase is fundamentally different in character, because we're no longer completely moving by step. We get this D natural, which has already come down a 3rd from the previous F. So we've come down a 3rd, then we go back up the 3rd before we finish on E. So the scale run downwards has now been disrupted by something that's different. It's also interesting to see what he does here with the chords and with the key, because, okay, it's an F minor start, but we're straight onto a D flat 7 chord. Okay, well, that's a chord 6-7, a submediant chord in F minor. Perhaps not the most obvious thing to do straight after a tonic chord of F minor, but it's interesting. But then he puts D natural into the melody. That's actually quite a brave thing to do, isn't it? You've got a D flat 7 chord with D flat obviously in the bass, and then suddenly D natural. Well, normally you'd be thinking, well, that's not a great move. But of course that D natural is just slightly anticipating that G7 chord that takes us to a C7 chord. So what's going on here? Well, the G7 to C kind of feels like, oh, we're in C major. We've gone dominant 7th to a tonic chord of C major. When we get to the C major chord, George Shearing says, well, hang on a minute, if we make that a C7, well, it's no longer a tonic chord in C major, it's a dominant 7th in F minor. So it's a very clever way of pulling us back to F minor. So you see, one thing I'm talking about here is how the harmony interacts with the melodic design. So a melody in the first phrase that breaks into 2 halves. That's the first half, here's the second half. So thinking about that, if you're a composer yourself wanting to write a good song, actually, what's the nature of my first phrase? Does that first phrase kind of work as a continuous whole? Sometimes that works really well. Or is it worth breaking it into 2 halves? And what makes the 2 halves slightly distinctive? And then thinking, well, what am I doing with the harmony there? So starting in F minor, going to that D flat 7, the kind of 6-7 if you like, but then having this what kind of feels like a secondary dominant into C, where we go dominant 7th in C to C major, but then we tuck in that 7th. And of course, what that's doing as well is making a connection between the end of this first 2-bar statement and what's coming next, because that C7 chord has to be resolved. It pulls us back onto the F minor chord at the beginning of bar 3. One thing that songwriters frequently find is a difficulty. You come to the end of a phrase, the music kind of sits down, and then you get started again. Well, George Shearing fixes that by, instead of using the C chord, using a C7 chord that kind of pulls you over the bar line into the next phrase. So it's kind of quite clever way of uniting your phrases, isn't it? And as I say, the harmony is not entirely predictable. You've also got this kind of tritone relationship out of the bass, you know, F, D flat, and then G. So that tritone thing with C back in the middle. And it's also interesting when you look at those 4 bass notes, F, D flat, G, C. Well, you know, F, D flat, G, C. Well, they're a third apart, the F and the D flat, and then they're kind of going out to G and C. So there's something in the harmony as well opening up like that that's quite interesting. And the connection between the second and the third chord, where you've got this tritone between the D flat and the G that's kind of has a real pull of its own. So lots of interesting ingredients just inside that first phrase. Well, what happens as we move out of the second bar, the second measure, into measure 3? Well, he kind of uses the second half of the first phrase. So if we're looking at the first phrase saying, well, here's the first half, that descending set of 5 notes, and here's the second half of it, the second idea. Can you see how when we go on, this is using the second half idea? Because starting back at this point, we've got, then he goes. So it's the same thing. But again, he's using this idea about 3 notes there, kind of expanding outwards. The D at the bottom goes down to C, the F and the E goes up to G, F. So do you see an idea that starts here that expands? A little bit like what we saw in the root movements. F, D flat, G, C is now happening in the melody, which is quite interesting. And of course, kind of adopting this rhythm as we go in here. Sometimes when you write your second phrase, you might think, well, I could start the second phrase the same way as I started the first phrase and then go somewhere new with it. But this is quite intriguing that George Shearing has said, well, I've got the first phrase in 2 halves. I'm going to use the second half rather than the first half to go on. And then he takes it further, because when you look at this next statement, you realize it's the same rhythm again, isn't it? And further expansion has come about. We've had, and we've expanded that to this. So the bottom goes lower, the top goes higher. But now, do you see what's happening? It's the same figure, isn't it? But you see how these intervals are expanding. Because back here, when we first heard this, that's a third. When we come into bar 3, it's become a 5th. And in bar 4, it becomes a 7th. And then we can also sort of hear the impact of harmony on this. So you notice in bar 3, even though we've used the second half idea when we start this phrase, we've actually borrowed the harmony from the first bar. So that's rather clever as well, isn't it? So going into bar 3, and then going into 4, you feel the expansion of that interval we talked about and how it makes that melody grow. Also, what are we doing? Well, bar 3, we're back with F minor, that D7 that we talked about before. But then kind of what we're doing is really heading for A flat major, aren't we? So B flat minor is called 2-7 in A flat major. E flat 7 is 5-7. So we're kind of feeling, aha, now we really are going into A flat major. And it's another pull, isn't it? Because at the end of this second phrase, we're using that seventh again, because that seventh we know is going to have to resolve to A flat. So the seventh again pulling us through the end of one phrase into the start of the next. So it's rather clever the way he's done that. Okay, so having done that, what happens next? Well, when we look at this, you can see that that is connected with this, isn't it? So at the beginning in bar 1, now when we get to the end of bar 4, exactly the same melody, but it's a third higher than it was. So we've kind of raised the emotional temperature a bit by placing it a third higher. Also, it kind of relates to the key, doesn't it? Because we were in F minor at the beginning. By going up a third, we can represent that in A flat major, this relative major thing. Okay, and interesting that the harmony in 5, we've now got A flat, but he's making it an A flat 7. He's really into his 7th chords, lots of chord extension in this piece. And then back to that F minor 7 again. So there's a kind of, we're always kind of never far away from the F minor, are we? But an F minor chord is chord 6 in A flat, as well as being chord 1 in F minor. Okay, so you see what we've done now. Having used the second half of the phrase in these places, we then go back to using the first part of the phrase. So then you think, oh, I know what he's going to do now. He's just going to use the second half of the phrase. Well, actually, what does he do? From the end of 5, he does something slightly different, doesn't he? So a different finish to the phrase, so it doesn't become too predictable. So you see the great design of this melody is how it has so much cohesion by reusing things, but doing it in an unpredictable way. You're never quite sure which twist in the tail is coming next. Well, what happens at this point is we almost have 2 parts within the same line. We have these kind of upper notes, which are the same both times. The C, B flat that comes twice. And down at the bottom, we've got this descending chromatic thing. F, E, E flat. So you kind of hear this kind of going down at the bottom and at the top. So, and that kind of gives it a certain independence from the previous material, yet we've still got the same kind of syncopated rhythm going on. What's happening with the chords? Well, in this phrase, we've got A flat 7, F minor 7, and then we're going to go to B flat minor 7, and then E flat 7, and again, quite brave with the E natural in there, and then back to this A flat 7 again. And then we just have this kind of quick finish, don't we really? Where's the kind of throwaway end of the phrase before we go on to the next bit. So there's quite a clever little internal design of the phrases, I'd suggest. And then what really gives it extra character is all the syncopated rhythm. You know, we've got some straight rhythm, like we've got at the beginning. I mean, it's a swing rhythm piece, obviously, but we soon get into syncopation, don't we? And if you take the syncopation out of this, it loses so much character. If you just did that, it wouldn't have the same kind of ring to it, would it? Put the syncopation back in, what's happening? Terrific stuff. And notice one other little rhythmic thing that he does. All these phrase endings, you know, we finish on that kind of 1.5 beat thing followed by the rest. 1.5 beats followed by a rest. You know, 1.5 beats followed by a rest. Plenty of that going on, isn't there? And then we have a kind of more continuous flow. But then just before the last thing, 2 beats followed by a rest. So even the rhythm becomes just slightly less predictable at that point. So this is what I'm suggesting is the kind of magic mix here, you know. What makes this an iconic song. And I think it's kind of how he designs the melody and the way we've talked about what's going on with the harmony, the modulations, the seventh chords pulling us across the bar line, the use of seventh chords in general, kind of making things rich, the clever use of notes that are not quite in the key that you're in, like things like that D natural we talked about up here, E natural down here, just give us a bit of colour, don't they? And then all the character that comes from the syncopated rhythm. There's much more we could say about that, and we could get into the rest of the song, but just looking at the first 8 bars of that, there's a huge amount that we can take away from that maybe helps us to appreciate what's particularly good about Lullaby of Birdland, what's George Shearing's kind of particular mix of magic, and ideas that we could take into our own songwriting. If you've enjoyed this video, well, you might want to go to our website, www.mmcourses.co.uk, where you'll be able to go into much more detail by clicking on our courses that cover theory, analysis, orchestration, aural work, all sorts of things that are designed to empower the all-round musician. So have a look there and see if there's anything of interest to you. You might also, while you're on the homepage, just click on Maestros, which is a link that will take you to our Maestros global community. And lots of exciting things going on there. Fun things, emojis, badges, access to behind the scenes material, that kind of stuff. But you also get discounts on our courses, so that might be useful. And you also have access to our monthly live streams. So 2 of those each month. One is kind of essentially some teaching input from me that might be about a composer, might be analysing a great piece of music in much more detail than we've been able to do in this video. Might be doing some composition or some harmony work, whatever people want, and often responding to requests that come from members. There's a live chat running through the whole thing, so you can pass comment, ask questions, and we can kind of share in that together. Then there's a second live stream where you can submit your own compositions, your own harmony, your own workings, kind of work in progress, questions you have about all sorts of things, recording of your own performance. And whatever it is you want to submit, I'm happy to give you one-to-one personal feedback on it. So positive evaluation and hopefully some pointers and thoughts on where to go next or answering any specific questions you have. And we share that again in the community with the live chat running so people can comment and ask their questions as well. And it's a great opportunity to learn from each other and to support each other. It's a very supportive group. And with so many musicians all over the world just kind of feeling that they're a bit out on their own with stuff, it's just great to be able to come together, realize other people are experiencing the same successes and challenges, and therefore we can all encourage and support each other and learn so much from each other. So if that's for you, there it is. Maestros.